Welcome back. He thought he was buying just a slave, but what arrived at his plantation was something far darker. A presence that watched, waited, and punished. Stay with me, because this is the story of the nightmare he could never escape. Before we begin, let the world around you fade. Lower the lights. Let the noise die out. Because the story you are about to hear is not meant to be rushed. It comes from a time when suffering had a price, when silence was trained into the bones of the living, and when the dead were expected to stay quiet. This is not just a story about cruelty. It is about consequences, about a man who believed ownership meant control, about a woman who learned that waiting could be sharper than any blade. He thought he bought a slave, something disposable, something powerless. What he truly bought was a past soaked in fire, grief, and memory. And once that past stepped onto his land, it began to wake up. The auction yard in Savannah, Georgia, was already exhausted when the sun began its slow descent. The air smelled of sweat, dust, and old fear. Fear that had settled into the ground over years, pressed down by boots, and stained by tears no one bothered to wipe away. Wooden planks creaked beneath the platform where people had been paraded since morning, turned, inspected, priced, and sold. Children had been pulled from mothers, husbands forced to watch as wives disappeared into crowds that refused to look back. Every scream eventually faded, swallowed by the rhythm of business. By late afternoon, most buyers were gone. Only a handful remained, men lingering with spare money and empty consciences. The auctioneer wiped his face, glanced at his ledger, and hesitated before speaking again. When he finally did, his voice lacked the confidence it once had. "One more lot," he announced. The words drifted into the yard and landed like a warning no one wanted to hear. They brought her out slowly, not because she resisted, but because even the guards seemed unsure of her. She walked barefoot across the dirt, chains loose at her wrists, her posture straight in a way that did not belong to someone broken. Her head was lowered, but not in defeat. It was the kind of stillness that comes from knowing exactly where you are and exactly what comes next. Something about her unsettled the crowd. No one stepped forward to touch her arms. No one asked her age. No one joked or laughed. A few men shifted uncomfortably. Someone muttered that there was something wrong with her. When the question finally came, why she was still unsold, the auctioneer paused longer than necessary. His fingers tightened on the ledger before he answered. "Previous owner passed," he said quietly. A man in the back asked how. The auctioneer swallowed. Suddenly, that single word drained the remaining noise from the yard. Laughter died in throats. Men stepped back, and in that silence, one hand rose. Edmund Crowell, plantation owner. Smiling, certain, unaware that the moment he placed his bid, the story had already begun to end. They arrived at Briarwood Plantation just as the last traces of sunlight were being swallowed by the dense trees that framed the property. The carriage wheels sank slightly into the damp, uneven ground, and fog began creeping in from the low swamp around the estate, curling like fingers across the road. Eliza sat quietly, her hands bound, shoulders straight, her eyes fixed forward, as if she already knew every twist and turn of this land. The driver, a man who had delivered dozens of slaves to plantations over the years, crossed himself more than once, muttering under his breath as if some unseen presence warned him to keep moving. Nothing about this girl seemed ordinary. Something about her presence alone made the tall cypress trees feel heavier, the air denser, and the very soil beneath their feet seemed to whisper secrets it should have buried long ago. When the plantation gates loomed into view, iron-rusted and half swallowed by thick vines, the main house rose like a shadow at the end of the long, winding drive. Crowell's men went ahead to prepare the yard and assign her a place among the other workers. She stepped down from the carriage without a word. Every step was precise, deliberate, almost careful. And yet, in that carefulness there was power. Quiet power. A kind that did not scream or demand attention, but that somehow made everyone else in the yard pause for just a heartbeat too long. The other slaves, watching from the fields and kitchens, felt it immediately. A cold, uneasy awareness spread among them. Whispers started before she even reached the far rows of cotton. "She doesn't sleep like us," one muttered. Her eyes, they never close. Another shook his head, muttering that the dogs in the yard refused to go near her, even when they were called. No one wanted to say anything louder, because speaking too much about her seemed to invite trouble, though none of them could yet explain what kind. From the very first morning at Briarwood, she began her work in silence. She carried baskets, picked cotton, tended the animals, and completed tasks with an efficiency that unnerved even the overseers. Her movements were never rushed, never hurried, yet they were flawless. Other slaves strained and stumbled in exhaustion, whispering and groaning under the relentless sun, but Eliza continued as though the weight of the day did not touch her. And, at night, when the rest collapsed into sleep under thin blankets and straw mats, she would remain seated or standing in the shadows, motionless, eyes open, staring into the darkness of the main house. The wind would rustle the trees, and sometimes the other slaves swore they could hear her whispering names into the soil, names that belonged to those long dead, or perhaps those who were yet to die. Crowell dismissed these reports, as he always did. For him, silence was obedience, and obedience was comfort. But the others, the ones who had witnessed her quiet patience, knew differently. They understood that something in her did not belong to this world of chains and orders. Something waited, something patient, and the air of dread that settled around her was proof enough that the ordinary rules of life and death would not hold here for long. The first death came quietly, almost unnoticed at first. It was the overseer who was found one dawn, lying twisted beside the tool shed. His neck was bent backward in a way that seemed impossible, unnatural, as if the very air had snapped it with invisible fingers. His eyes were wide open, staring into nothing, frozen in a terror that seemed unfinished, as though he had glimpsed something far beyond the world of the living, and it refused to release him. No bruises marred his skin, no footprints surrounded him, no weapon was nearby. The other slaves trembled as they were forced to gather near his body. Crowell's voice cut through the yard, demanding answers, accusing them all. Beatings followed. Questions were asked. The overseer's body remained in its twisted silence, a wordless accusation that something far stranger than rebellion had walked among them. That night, Crowell could not sleep. The mansion's walls creaked under the wind, and shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should. He thought he heard footsteps outside his bedroom door, soft, deliberate, patient. He held his breath and opened the door. Nothing. No one was there, only damp soil on the floorboards, as if some presence had brushed past him and returned to the earth itself. He tried to convince himself it was imagination, but he could feel the unease crawling into his chest, an itch of fear that no coin, no authority, no power could scratch. Something about Eliza, the girl he thought he owned, was moving through the plantation in ways he could neither see nor control. Then came the others. The stable hand, crushed beneath a beam that was stronger than any normal wood should have been. The cook, drowned in a well shallow enough to stand in, her body eerily intact and untouched. Each death came silently, efficiently, and without witnesses. The air seemed to carry their absence like a warning to anyone still alive. And always Eliza was there, watching, calm, unbroken. It was as if the world had been reset around her, as if she existed outside the normal laws of life and death. Fear spread like a slow poison among the remaining workers. They whispered in corners, never daring to speak aloud, never daring to draw attention. And yet, even in the shadows, her presence was a pulse that could not be ignored. Desperation finally drove Crowell to seek the truth in cold ink and brittle parchment. He sent letters to other plantations, to towns far from Savannah, requesting records of Eliza's previous ownership. Weeks passed. When the documents finally arrived, he could barely hold them. 3 plantations, 3 owners, all dead. Fire, drowning, mysterious accidents. Each record ended with the same chilling observation. The girl had never tried to run. She never resisted. She had waited. And yet somehow she had left death in her wake. Crowell read and reread the accounts, his mind struggling to comprehend what he held. History, it seemed, had been watching him long before he even stepped foot in that yard. And history, he was beginning to realize, was not finished. Her story began long before she ever set foot on Briarwood. Her mother had come from across the sea, carrying knowledge that terrified the ignorant, herbs and old words, healing arts passed down through generations, secrets of the body, the mind, and the spirit. People had called her a witch. They had feared what they could not control. And when a master's child fell ill, it was her fault that they said, though the sickness had no name and no reason. Her mother had been dragged to the yard, tied to a post, and burned alive. Flames licked at her flesh, while her eyes remained calm, unwavering, fixed on something far beyond the immediate terror. As the fire consumed her, she pressed a final charge into her daughter, a vow, an oath, a curse. She told Mercy that no man who claimed to own her would ever know peace in death, that the debt of cruelty would always come due. Mercy had never tried to escape. She had not run, not fought, not begged. She waited. She learned the ways of observation, the subtleties of human fear, the quiet patterns of those who believed themselves in control. And she moved with patience, letting the world make its mistakes, letting the arrogance of men lead them into their own doom. When she arrived at Briarwood, she did not speak. She did not protest. She did not cry. She waited, letting the air around her fill with a tension so thick it pressed on lungs and bones alike. Even the wind seemed to behave differently near her, moving slower, holding the scent of damp earth and smoke. The slaves whispered, watching her. warning each other with hushed tones. They feared the girl who could wait forever, and yet they were drawn to her calm presence, like moths circling a flame too bright to approach. That night, the plantation erupted in chaos. The wind picked up, screaming through the trees, carrying with it the sound of the past pressing on the present. Lanterns shattered, their light vanishing in flickers of fire. Horses bolted from their stables, their hooves thundering against the dirt and wooden beams. Crowell ran through the chaos, smoke curling around him, heat licking at his face. He could hear the faint whispers of mercy carried on the wind, voices of those long dead, warning him, reminding him, guiding him to the inevitable. The house itself seemed to come alive, fire spreading with impossible speed, consuming walls and floors. And when Crowell reached the river at the edge of the plantation, he found hands, cold, strong, grasping his ankles, pulling him down into the water, dragging him beneath the surface. And through it all, Mercy's voice floated across the river like a final echo. "You bought my body," she said softly, "but you never owned my past." The morning Mercy was gone. Not a trace remained. No footprints. No chains. Nothing to suggest she had ever been there at all. The plantation itself fell silent, as if holding its breath, mourning, or perhaps respecting, the power that had passed through it. The remaining workers dared not speak. Even the wind seemed to carry a warning now, whispering through the cypress trees and around the ruins of the burned mansion. And though Crowell was gone, the story did not end. The estate was abandoned within the year, its gates rusted shut, its walls crumbling. Yet locals whispered that a barefoot woman could still be seen wandering among the remnants. Some swore they could hear faint voices, calling names in the dead of night, carried on the fog like secrets that refused to die. And if you are listening now, in the quiet of your room, perhaps the only sound is your own breathing. But sometimes, when the wind moves just right, or the shadows stretch a little too long, you may hear a name. A whisper that floats closer than it should. That is when you must remember the story is never truly over. Some presences linger, some pasts cannot be owned, and some voices wait patiently for the world to listen. So if you ever feel that icy brush on the back of your neck, or hear your name whispered faintly in the dark, remember Mercy, remember Briarwood, and pray that she is not saying yours. By morning she was gone. No footprints, no chains, just the ruins of Briarwood and whispers that still linger in the wind. And, if you listen closely tonight, you might hear her calling your name,